Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Our webinar is going to begin in just a few seconds. Please stand by and while we allow everyone to log in and get settled. Just a few moments. Excellent. Well, I see so many of you joining already, and we're so excited to have you with us this afternoon. We are really pleased to bring you this next leading local session on bridging divides. My name is Manuel, and I'm the CEO and Executive Director of the Institute for Local Government, and I'm going to be your moderator for the session today. As I mentioned, we are so excited to be here with all of you. Before we get started, we'll just do a couple housekeeping notes and disclaimers. Next slide, please. We're going to be recording today's webinar, and we're going to share the recording and any related resources with all the registrants following the webinar. All of your lines have been muted for the duration of this session, but you can ask a question at any time by typing it into the questions box on that right-hand side of your screen. Anything you put in the questions box is directly only for the panelists and the host and the webinar moderators, so we will only see your questions. But they'll be anonymous to other registrants, and you can feel comfortable asking whatever questions you have for us. We do have time set aside today for a Q&A at the end of our session, but we might take some throughout our conversation if it fits in nicely, and we'll try and take as many questions as we can during the time that we have. If you have any technical difficulties during this session, you can also feel free to use that questions box and that function, and one of our session coordinators behind the scenes will help you. Next slide, please. Before we dive into the program for this afternoon, I just want to tell you a little bit about ILG while all of you are logging in. As I mentioned during the intro, my name is Manuel. I am the CEO and Executive Director of the Institute for Local Government. I've been leading ILG for about 2 years now, and I think just like you, we are all navigating COVID and adjusting to the twists and the turns of the past year. Many of you know that 2020 was one of the most difficult years for local government, and that's really in a lifetime. And so the good news for you is that ILG is nonprofit, we are nonpartisan, and we are here to help. We are the nonprofit training and education affiliate of 3 statewide associations representing local governments. That's the League of California Cities, CSAC, and the California Special Districts Association. Together with these 3 affiliates, we serve over 2,500 local agencies and their leaders. And that includes cities, and that includes counties and special districts. We try to offer practical, easy-to-use resources so you have resources and tools to effectively implement policies on the ground. And really, truly, we love and understand local government, and that's why what we do at ILG centers around helping local leaders navigate complexity and the ever-changing nature of their roles. And that is one of the reasons why I'm so excited about the webinar today. This Leading Local series is really focused on acknowledging the pressures of local leadership and supporting each of you during this time. Next slide. We have 4 main pillars of work at ILG. Those are listed on the screen. They're leadership and governance, civics and education and workforce, public engagement, and sustainable and resilient communities. And really through all of this work, we're trying again to help you navigate that complexity of your roles and also be able to do more as leaders in government to really help maintain and ensure that our democracy stays strong and that there is a pipeline for government in the future. We center all of our work in the principles of equity and inclusion. Next slide. So we have a leadership and governance pillar, and that work has been the foundation of our organization for many years. The resources that we offer, consulting services we offer, really do help elected leaders and staff build that foundation of good government. That's trust, that's accountability, that's responsiveness, and that's transparency. And you can go to our website to see what kinds of free resources we have available. We do focus on leadership, on ethics, on accountability and equity, and those are key pillars and really elements for how we can help local agencies increase trust with their residents and in their communities. Next slide. So our new Leading Local series is one of my special favorites. We have been over the past year thinking about how, even more than ever, to make adjustments to the work that we do as local government leaders, because we've had to pivot, we've had to evolve so quickly in the face of the triumphs and challenges that we've experienced over the past year. ILG's team had to make significant adjustments, and we watched local government do the same thing, and you bravely adjusted to what I think is the new normal for us all. And you have been really leading by example and really taking on so much work, so much responsibility and the commitment that you have shown for your communities it's truly admirable. But many of you are exhausted, you're tired, and you are looking for support, and that's what Leading Local is about. It's specifically about expert insights on leadership, on governance, on ethics, and on equity. And the series is a thought leadership forum for those topics. And we're going to have content throughout the year and maybe even into 2022 to really cover some of the things that we see that you are challenged with and working through and grappling with every day. Next slide. So today's webinar is really focused on bridging divides. We're going to be addressing how to navigate the increased partisanship and division that so many of us are experiencing in our communities, in our homes, in our families even. ILG works really, really closely with local leaders, and that's from cities, from counties, and special districts throughout California every single day. And we support both elected officials and staff. And one of the most prevalent comments that we have received over the past few years is related to partisanship. So divisiveness and partisanship have become increasingly prevalent in local government, and our webinar is going to tackle, or at least begin to tackle, this issue head on. We're going to provide an introduction for how local government leaders can address the issue, and then we're going to talk about what is both seen at the national, the statewide, and the local level. And then we're going to explore some of the challenges you might be facing and what role you may be able to play in your attempts to lead from the front and set an example for your communities. So our disclaimer here, and my disclaimer here, is that this is a very nuanced issue, and we're not going to be able to solve the issue today or give you a holy grail or special magic wand to solve it. But what we are going to be able to do is here's some options and here's some approaches you might take if you are experiencing this. And so we hope that we will be able to give you a forum to ask questions and that you'll be able to do that in a safe space. And that's one of the reasons why we've chosen this particular webinar platform, is for that anonymity. All of your questions today will be anonymous, and you can ask them in that spirit. Speaking of, just a reminder on how to do that. If you just joined us, feel free to use the questions box on the webinar overview, and the next slide shows you how to do that. Use the questions box to type in your questions at any time, and we'll work behind the scenes to gather those questions and ask them at the appropriate time. You can also ask questions about logistics if you need to. If you're struggling in any way with sound, or if you're struggling with visuals, we're happy to try and work behind the scenes to address that. Next slide. All right, let's get started with our webinar. I am so excited to be hosting our intimate conversation today with John Wood Jr. He's the National Ambassador for Braver Angels. I actually came across Braver Angels organization in 2020 when I was just trying to make some sense of what we call the twin pandemics of both COVID and social justice. And that was packaged along with that incredibly divisive and very, I think, it's a different kind of election, right, at the national level. And I was gathering some content for some ILG blogs and articles about how local government leaders may be able to handle what we were experiencing in the field. And specifically, in addition to that triage of the COVID response protocols and everything you all were doing from that pandemic response, we were seeing absolute chaos around conversations tied to that social justice, equity, race. So many of those very difficult contexts were all compounded by that national election, and the extremely divisive rhetoric and maybe less than civil behavior that really descended on our halls of government. And that was at all levels of government. I know that in a virtual environment, some of you, like us, saw partisanship at an all-time high. I think that people really felt emboldened, right, with the comfort of these Zoom screens that we're all on now, and then the social media handles and the many, I think people really demonstrated some challenging behavior towards their local government leaders, and you all took that and the brunt of that. I think Braver Angels was one of the organizations I found that I was incredibly impressed with. So they focus on bridging the divide between red and blue, and it's America's largest bipartisan grassroots organization dedicated to the work of political depolarization. So today we're going to speak with John Wood Jr. He is the National Ambassador for Braver Angels, but he's also based here in California. John is a former nominee for Congress and the former vice chairman of the Republican Party of Los Angeles County. He is an author and contributor with works featured in publications like the Wall Street Journal, small little newspaper, Washington Examiner, the Real Clear Politics, and USA Today. He's a noted speaker in the subject of political and racial reconciliation, and he is also the co-host of Braver Angels podcast. So welcome, John.
Thank you so much, Erica.
All right. So good to see you, and I'm so glad to have you on today. This is just a conversation between you and I, really understanding kind of what you're seeing as both a California resident, but also in the context of the work that you're doing at the national level. So much has taken place since your organization was founded, and certainly since it's sort of repackaged itself as well. Tell us a little bit about Braver Angels and the work that you do in this space.
Sure, absolutely. So it's great to be speaking with you, Erica, and it's great to be speaking to this audience in particular, folks who are on the ground, really sort of experiencing the impact of our social divisions in an upfront and personal sort of way. But folks who I would imagine across the boards are working earnestly to create better communities for the people of California. You're just the type of group I like to connect with. So I'm sincerely glad to be able to speak to you all today. So let me give you folks the elevator summation very quickly. Braver Angels is America's largest grassroots bipartisan organization dedicated to the work of political depolarization. And the word depolarization can mean a couple of different things. What I mean by that primarily is reviving the communal spirit of American democracy, if you will, in a manner that allows us to relate to each other more empathetically and to collaborate with each other more effectively in local communities and across our civic and key national institutions. And so Braver Angels is active in 4 sectors, and increasingly 5, matter of fact. We do work with government and politicians and elected officials. As a matter of fact, our co-founder, William Doherty, professor of psychology at the University of Minnesota, just recently testified before the Select Committee for the Modernization of Congress. We are working to see that our programs be adopted within the House of Representatives and within the Senate. So that's a big task, but something that we are sort of nudging a door open for. We are active in the media. We have a fledgling digital media network called Braver Angels Media. Erica mentioned the Braver Angels podcast, which I'd like to tell folks, by the way, as of December of 2020, was ranked the 159th most popular politics podcast in America, which doesn't sound like much until you remember there are about 20,000 politics podcasts in the country. So we're proud of that. And of course, we have other collaborations in this space. We work in college campuses. We even have a singer-songwriter community. We work a bit in art and entertainment, but primarily we are located on the grassroots. We are a membership organization, 10,000 dues-paying members across the country, and 80 local Braver Angels alliances, which you can think of as bipartisan chapters, which are equipped to build out the work of Braver Angels locally, and even to organize around issues of bipartisan concern in a given locale or state. And so you might be asking, well, okay, all of that's great. What does Braver Angels do specifically? We have a range of activities. A big part of our work focuses on cultivating the skills and the attitudes necessary for being able to relate to your fellow American across the partisan line and across racial divides and other divisions as well. Some of you who are familiar with our work may be familiar with something called a red-blue workshop. It is a model where we'll take small groups of folks from the left and from the right, bring them into a shared space, not to argue or debate politics, but to speak from the vantage point of personal or lived experience in terms of why we see politics the way that we do. It is quite literally the application of marriage counseling to the relationships between Republicans and Democrats, which is probably appropriate for a country that feels like it's on the brink of divorce now and again. Folks in our organization, people who participate in our programs, have the opportunity to learn from these sorts of experiences. We do actually have debate programs. There are opportunities to advocate within Braver Angels, but then we have the opportunity to take those skills and to take those norms and organize in our local communities, or otherwise take them back to the institutions within which we have residence, whether we work in a corporation or in a local government or in a college campus, etc. So that, in a walloping nutshell, is the work of Braver Angels, and you may find it relevant to some of the work that you folks do.
Absolutely, and we're so excited about what you talked about and how you're growing in California. And one of the reasons why I was so excited to speak with you and why I'm so fascinated by your organization, among others, is because we have experienced that so many people are seeing and experiencing polarization and divisiveness, and particularly our local government leaders. They are feeling like they are surrounded by it, but that also that maybe not everyone wants to do it, but feels that they need to do it. And certainly elected officials and staff are in different positions, as one is going to be, running for office and the other is going to be continuing to kind of serve regardless of the administration leadership. But there certainly is this perception across certain people that, maybe we're not as polarized as we think, and that some of this is just driven by the media, right? And that it's not an honest polarization, there's fuel to the fire. You have a media organization as part of yours. What do you think of the role of media in all of that?
Well, I think that you're right to set up the question the way that you did. So I guess we can ask ourselves, is polarization in American society something that is sort of artificially engineered, or are there deep divisions that really are in earnest? And the answer, as you might expect, is that I think it's a combination of the two. I do think that we live in a period of time wherein we are faced with challenges to the social fabric, challenges to the solidarity of civil society, as a consequence of the fact that American society over recent decades has become, demographically speaking, far more diverse. In addition to that simple diversity, you have new voices who are rising through the ranks of our institutions, who are bringing new perspectives and challenging traditional narratives. You have that organic component, which then I think in turn interacts with certainly technology, which has heightened our natural tendency towards conflict and kind of scaled it up in an artificial way. But then behind all of that, you have what at this point is, I think, probably about, arguably 40 years and definitely, 20 solid years of business model driven augmentation of the polarization, exacerbation of the polarization, coming to us directly from the partisan media establishments. There used to be a time, of course, when, and not to be too nostalgia driven, right? But there used to be a time when the general reputation of the media was such that it was understood that Walter Cronkite was a person who was trying to speak to all Americans, and that CBS, NBC, ABC, they represented something of a universal standard for the dissemination of information, and the tone with which they spoke tended to be one that sought to bring the constituencies of the American public together in a single audience. The business model has dramatically changed since then for a number of different reasons. But the business model now, of course, is to be able to cut off a certain part of the American electorate, feed them a storyline which confirms their natural biases and prejudices politically, and perhaps capitalizes on our fears, so that a given media company can take ownership of a certain part of the audience, a certain part of the body politic, and in so doing, cut them off from being able to effectively and accurately understand the motivations and the moral values and the perspectives and the lived experiences, the personal experiences of people on the other side of the divide. This is a tremendous hindrance, both to the everyday functioning of government, as well as to the health of our social fabric and really the psychological health of the American people as individuals, families, and communities. And so the work that we're doing at Braver Angels has a lot to do with seeking to create a structure that allows for all Americans to show up in their full authenticity, in their full subjectivity, but to create a structure and to equip the American people with skills and narratives that allow them to more effectively see and communicate with the humanity of people on the other sides of some of these divisions, and to give them vehicles for actively collaborating and working together in that newly forged spirit of what we refer to as patriotic empathy. This idea that your love for your country is demonstrated by the concern that you bear for your fellow Americans. And so that is what we're up against, and that I think is what each and every one of you are up against to one degree or another in the context of local government, because the national divisions have become increasingly local. And for folks who are interested in hearing me speak today, you probably agree with that. And that that might be a reason why this conversation is particularly worth your time.
Absolutely. We are seeing that, we are hearing that, we are feeling that there is there's a difficult, I think, and staff and elected officials at the local level have slightly different roles, right? At the staff level, you have to keep the business going. You have to keep the business of government moving. You have to keep essential services moving. And certainly that is the responsibility of elected officials. Right. But elected officials also, in many ways, have to campaign and be political and be certainly, out front and aligned with their constituents in the spirit of certain issues, right? And one of the things that we saw certainly in the last year is that things like the pandemic and public health and racial justice really further polarized our communities. How do you think that hurt or helped or impacted partisanship, in your opinion? I mean, it seems to be grown dramatically because of that. And I'm curious to know how that has evolved, how that's changed your work.
Right, indeed. Well, there are a couple of aspects to that. There's one technical component, which is the fact that the pandemic, precipitated the lockdown, which left us in a situation to where in-person gathering and in-person organizing was minimized across the scope of American life, and it's still diminished. And of course, we don't entirely know what policies and adjustments may be around the corner for us, but it required us to relocate our work online. And there was a question because up until that time, Braver Angels work, Braver Angels, originally Better Angels, by the way, but Braver Angels work was overwhelmingly in person, focused on local community gatherings, campus-based gatherings, etc. We wondered if we could effectively facilitate the sorts of tried and true methodologies and interventions that we had designed in a digital space, in a way that would work. Turned out that even though there's no replacing in-person gatherings, we were able to effectively conduct our work digitally. And it came with tremendous advantages, ultimately, because it allowed us to reach more people and to bring people together across greater geographical distances. And so in that sense, the lockdown ultimately proved to be a boost to our efforts. But what the pandemic itself, I think, did was to both, well, I would argue that the pandemic managed to reveal the depth of the distrust that was already pre-existing in American society, and to exacerbate it further still in many critical respects. In the initial week or two of the lockdown, when the attention of the country was wholly centered on this emergent virus, you all remember, Erica, I'm sure you'll remember that there was sort of a brief window of time where you really sort of saw the best in people. I mean, for a couple of weeks or so, you could turn on partisan media outlets, and yes, there's sniping from CNN about how Donald Trump may have been handling things. Fox, you would have heard their commentators say some acerbic things, but there was the sense that we were all in it together, and even the most partisan pundits were sort of speaking in that language, that this was a time for shared sacrifice, for solidarity, for us to come together the way we might have come together in the aftermath of 9/11, in the midst of a war effort, to see to it that we protected our neighbors and did what was best for the country. But that broke down very, very quickly. And when George Floyd was killed, and the protests spilled into the streets of American cities, you saw the distrust of American institutions, particularly, become sort of flagrant in the attitudes of the body politic. And so our distrust of law enforcement was deeply, deeply evident. But our distrust of the medical establishment was also deeply evident in the polarization of our responses to the mask mandates and to edicts and announcements that were coming from the Center for Disease Control and organized bodies of medical professionals. You had an interaction between the medical community's response to the virus, but also to the social justice-oriented protests in the streets, which allowed for some folks on the right to say that the health of the American people was less important to many doctors than was the ideology of social justice activism, et cetera, et cetera. You had conservatives protesting policies who protesting lockdown policies, who felt like the media treated them in ways far different than they would have treated Black Lives Matter protesters. And all of this preceded the 2020 election, when, the American people, and certainly, given the fact that Donald Trump, of course, lost the election, we all know what happened after that. There was this deep-seated distrust that was sown even before Election Day in the legitimacy, or the potential legitimacy, of our electoral system itself and the people who were governing that process. But I would wager that had it gone the other way, you would have seen some level of discontent and some level of disbelief at the legitimacy of the process that could theoretically have produced a legitimate reelection of President Donald Trump. And I say that merely because American confidence in institutions is at an all-time low, and that distrust is largely bipartisan. And so it's no coincidence that that happens at a moment in which the partisan narratives are more thoroughly dominating of the national consciousness than they've ever been. And, in a moment wherein, as I said, we are experiencing a diversification of the body politic, shifting of demographics in American institutions, coupled with social media and technology, that make this the perfect storm for polarization and potentially the collapse of the American experiment in terms of the functioning of our democracy and civil society,
Okay.
if we do not take constructive means to counteract it.
Well, and that is an important part, right? So this is really about the foundation of democracy, and certainly, ILG is in the business of thinking about government and the foundations of government and sustaining that, right? We believe in and love local government. We want to make sure there's a pipeline of people that want to work in government, that want to give back to their communities by being public servants. And we want there to be trust in communities for their local agencies, who are so many times, leading and are the closest thing that they have to a government that impacts them day to day, right? The decisions that are made at the local level are day-to-day impacts that are happening at the neighborhood level, and at the individual household level. So trust is critical, and certainly engaging in that government process in a productive way is also critical. And as a local government leader, so many of the people we work with are feeling so frustrated because they've got to continue doing this really important work, but in the context of this very divisive conversation that continues. And even though we talk about 2020 like it was a lifetime ago, it wasn't very long ago. And it's still, I think, we're still experiencing it now. And I think we're still, as you said, we have an opportunity. We're at a precipice, and we have the opportunity to make some adjustments that can continue this path forward in a positive direction. But we also are at the risk of crumbling some of these very veneered institutions, and not for the better. So how do we move forward with that? What is the opportunity that you think we have, right? Your organization is based on that foundation of having these conversations and then helping them be more constructive. What do you think that opportunity is that we should be taking right now?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, let me speak a little bit to sort of the longer term vision of Brave Rangers, if you will, because on the one hand, I mentioned we're the largest such organization in the country, but on the other hand, that's not saying too much. There really haven't been any organizations like ours, not too many organizations like ours, in years past. So, ours represents the beginning of a very significant effort to build up an infrastructure for civic reconnection across American civil society, if you will. When I was running for Congress, I was a bit of an odd kind of political animal, because I had, I come from a family which is both biracial and bipartisan. My mother is a liberal Black Democrat from South Central Los Angeles. My father is a conservative white Republican from Tennessee. I had worked on Barack Obama's campaign as a Democrat in 2008. I became a Republican later on. But, even before our sort of modern post-Trump, or, Trump and post-Trump era of polarization, I had developed a deep sort of anathema, or a deep sort of distaste for a political culture that tends to simplify the American people into dismissible stereotypes. And so I ran for office as a hope and change Republican, basically, which meant that, one, I had a lot of explaining I had to do when people wanted to know more about my message, but that, two, though a bit more conservative on policy, I believed in this idea that we should be seeing each other in a way that allowed for us to understand that while our ethnic and partisan identities matter, that this is not a black, white, or Latino America, but a United States of America, and that we should find a way to speak that brings us together. But in campaigning, it became clear to me that it is difficult to find an organized sort of base of support that is not nested within a polarized sort of institutional context many times, because our institutions have found themselves, whether explicitly or implicitly, having to more or less take sides in the culture wars. And so if I was looking for a certain base of support, I was conscious of the fact that I was frequently stepping into a Democratic room or Republican room. But folks who want to organize across party lines don't necessarily have the structures to do so. Not all the time, not most of the time. And so part of what Braver Angels hopes to accomplish is in seeding norms that allow us to effectively empathize and collaborate across the aisle, to put forward structures that would allow for elected officials and staff who wish to be able to campaign and govern in a way that brings people who have, let's say, strong partisan convictions, but nevertheless a willingness to work together as a community into a space that facilitates that sort of interaction and trust, right? And so rather than having to be pulled in one direction or another, where some of you as elected officials and politicians may feel like you are being pressured or forced by the powers that be to speak in a way and to campaign in a way that may not completely line up with the way you would like to communicate, but which you have to, as a matter of political reality, sort of acquiesce to. We hope to be able to create the context for coalitions and constituencies that can allow elected officials to speak a more unifying language of politics and government, right? And so that is a long-term vision that we are in the process of building out now, that I hope folks in this call may be interested in knowing more about. But in the short term, I think it has to be emphasized that local electeds and staff are better positioned than any elected officials and leaders across the country in general, any class of political officials across the country, to be able to model the sort of communal and empathetic and cross-partisan, cross-cultural sort of discourse and leadership. You are better positioned to affect this change in culture than anybody else, because you are close enough to your constituents to be able to affect their lives in materially demonstrable ways, to have personal relationships with them. And local government is still, although, this is, of course, as we mentioned, sadly, changing a bit if we're not able to prevent it. But local government is still, relatively speaking, more insulated from the national sort of polarization in a way that allows us some degree of freedom on the local level to be able to bring people together on the basis of interests and values that still transcend the simplified sort of left-right binary that comes to us from the cable news stations and the talk radio stations, et cetera, et cetera. However, I think that local officials need to be able to take that leverage and that connection that they have in the community and help model that way of approaching governance in the digital space, in informational spaces, that allow for us to begin to shift the national tenor of politics from the demand level up, if you will. So digital media is an incredible tool for this. Podcasts, YouTube videos. Part of what we're working on at Braver Angels, in collaboration with many other folks, is building out the network structures in the digital space that will allow us to tell the stories of elected officials, of local activists, of local staffers, of local community leaders, community social impact-based organizational leaders, et cetera, who are demonstrating a way of doing politics, a way of doing democracy, which implies the answer to our culture of division on the national level. We need to be able to tell your stories and scale them up to national audiences using the vehicle of digital media and using some of the other tools that we have at our disposal that represent alternative pathways to information dissemination, in contrast to, of course, what we currently have available to us through the traditional sort of political media and media mainstream. But that requires infrastructure building on the messaging side, right? And as we move forward in building out those sorts of structures, those sorts of resources, that in turn creates an opportunity to connect with and to build local constituencies on the strength of narratives and stories that are picked up in the internet space, picked up in the digital space, that allows to tell the story of folks who are working across the aisle in order to fix problems and concerns in a local school district in Los Angeles or in Alameda County or Ventura or the Bay Area. It allows us to tell stories in a way that links these stories back to constituents on the ground who see them and say, I want to get involved in work like that in my local community. How can I support the efforts of leaders in my community who are modeling this better way of doing democracy? So creating these sorts of circuits based on the strength of local leadership and the example of local leadership is an opportunity that is available to us as we look forward and ask ourselves, how can we begin to build institutions and models for organizing and for messaging that can shine a light forward in terms of what the new paradigm might look like that allows us to break out of this sort of false polarization or the artificial element of our polarization in order to create collaboration and a culture of patriotic empathy across the divide on the local level and beyond. So
I love that.
There's a lot of innovation to come.
That is fantastic, and I certainly appreciate, as a fan of local government, appreciate that there are so many communities that are modeling this behavior already, that are trying to rise against the tide that they might see or that they might be experiencing, and demonstrating that there is the opportunity to collaborate, to lead effectively as a group, as an elected official, a body, whether it's a city council or county supervisors or even a special district board. Those elected officials, so many across the state, are doing a fantastic job of rising above. Certainly. And you mentioned, that they have platforms, right, that they can share that information about how to govern and lead as a team when they need to, and to compromise when they need to, and to actively, demonstrate certainly the willingness to listen, the humanity of their fellow local government leaders, and certainly of their constituents, and then also really thinking about the best interests of their community, finding those shared values. And we absolutely agree and believe that there is the opportunity for that to, not only does it exist already, but there's the opportunity to expand it and to do more of it and to showcase it. And so I love that you are all working nationally to model at the local level. So much we hear that national politics drives what happens at the local level. It's nice to start with the grassroots movement that moves local and shows national maybe where to go. We absolutely love that and would love to support that. And I know that we're working together, hopefully, on some potential programs and partnerships with Braver Angels to think about how we can operationalize some of these things in California, certainly with local government and others. Really quickly, I do want to move on to some specific tactics and techniques that we can consider at the local level that will help drive us to this place where we can not only showcase good work that's being done, but if you're at the very beginning stages of this and you're just mired in what you feel is an untenable situation with your communities or with your elected officials or even at the staff level, some things that local agency leaders can do. And so I want us to move us into that. But before we do, I would love to have a quick insight from you about civility, because we've talked about civility at ILG as something certainly for people to consider and absolutely to honor. And for us, civility doesn't mean that you step back and compromise on ideals or real foundational principles, but it's really about thinking of government as an opportunity to hear, to listen, to share, to honor lived experiences, and do that in a way that is respectful to the partner that you are engaging with. But talk to us about how civility plays into this conversation and the conversations you have at Braver Angels. What is the role of that in political discourse, in your opinion?
Indeed, it is a tremendously interesting question, because civility is something that it is a concept that you never would have thought would be controversial, but actually sort of is.
I know.
Right? And it's not just a function of the fact that people, want to fight with each other, but even people who would like to see, more civil discourse have concerns about naming civility as a priority.
Right.
Because, many people are of the feeling, I think for very understandable reasons, particularly as you look at some aspects of our history as a nation, the ways in which certain voices have been marginalized in our institutional and political context, that the norms of civility can have a way of muzzling the true sorts of emotional and spiritual sort of fervor that we have for change and equity and justice, because it requires sometimes a dampening of passion, right? And a sort of, relegating of the deeper heart of some of our concerns to the sidelines for the sake of being able to preserve a certain culture of etiquette. And so you have a lot of people who are pushing back against that and saying, no, if your brand of, if civility is something that's going to keep me from telling the whole truth in terms of what I feel about systemic racism or voter fraud, or pick your issue, whatever it may be. Many people feel like civility is not the priority here. But here's what I have to say about civility. I think that civility is a good thing, but I think that civility is more itself sort of a thermostat, if you will, more itself sort of a measurement of the health of other values in civil society that are themselves more fundamental than mere civility. If you are able to establish a context of civility where people are able to speak reasonably to one another, politely, with a certain sort of decor and demeanor, that probably suggests that there is already a baseline level of respect and understanding that exists between the parties in a conversation that allows for that civility to be possible. There's already a certain degree of trust upon which civility rides. It is the lack of trust in our society that is itself the deeper problem that is suggested, that is implied by the absence of civility. We don't trust each other anymore. And so what I emphasize is trust, and also, even more so, the need for goodwill in our politics, the need for goodwill in our civic and democratic culture. Erica, I think you know this about me, but I consider myself to be a student of the philosophy of nonviolence in the Kingian tradition. And what Martin Luther King Jr. taught philosophically, what nonviolence was about, is the starting supposition that love is a spiritual value that can be applied to the work of social change. And when Dr. King said love, he meant by that something that is specifically referred to as agape love, and that can be translated as goodwill. And so I use the phrase goodwill because it's a little more accessible for some folks, but meaning the same thing, that agape love or goodwill allows us to more effectively, when we are able to signal goodwill to our opponents, we are able to communicate to them that we are not an enemy, that we pursue the things that we pursue politically and socially, not to defeat or humiliate them and empower ourselves alone, but rather to make society fairer, freer, and more just for all people. And in so doing, we give our opponents emotional and psychological permission to listen to what we have to say in a genuine and thoughtful way. And even if they fail to do so, we remove from ourselves the albatross of judgmentalism and fear that can make it psychologically difficult for us to function in environments that are so laden with conflict and animus, right? So I'm a great champion for, and Braver Angels seeks to create structures for leaning into goodwill and modeling goodwill as the foundation for both discourse and organizing, in ways that make us more effective persuaders and champions for our political causes, and that also equip us psychologically and spiritually to be able to endure the gamut of modern American politics. And so,
I love that word endure, in part because I know that our local leaders have endured quite a bit over the past few months and the years. And, we're getting questions in the questions box. So thank you everyone for dropping those questions in. And some of the comments are related to just the experience of the past year plus, where local governments, even in a virtual environment, are just being bombarded by, to your point, residents that have such frustration and maybe lack of trust and have exhibited so much hostility. And it's a frustration to lead by example and be civil when you are being what feels like attacked, right? And you do speak about having a real obvious and intentional dialogue about intentions, about your goals, about your shared values. And I do appreciate that that could be a really good starting point for some of these local agency leaders when, you know, they are being put in a position where they have to listen to a public comment that is not in any way along the lines of what you would call, I would certainly put it in the hostile category versus the kind, and where they have to hear that and then also try to respond appropriately and to demonstrate and lead appropriately. We're seeing and hearing that people want to trust government, but they feel like there's a huge mountain to climb there. Some of the things we're going to talk about in just a few minutes might help you get up that mountain, which are to help build trust, which are to help explain maybe what your philosophies might be and what your shared values are for your community, and the approach that you want to take. There are some foundational steps that local leaders can take in this process to begin the process. Again, this is not there's no holy grail. This is going to be a long and probably arduous effort for each community, and it's going to be a little different in each community because you all have different issues to deal with, but certainly we do have some tips we're going to share with you. I want to close us out on this portion of that, and my last question is really speaking to this remote work, remote meetings. Can you tell us how you think, in your opinion, that has changed this discussion? Has it? I know certainly your organization has had to transition things to a virtual environment, and that's shown some positives and negatives. We've seen that remote work and employees working remotely, and then certainly this digital experience has changed our entire, the opportunity that we have to engage. Talk to us about the opportunity that local government has to engage in a digital environment that we anticipate will continue in a digital environment moving forward.
Yeah, right. Well, you know, it's a great question and a frustrating question, because I imagine that most of us, if not all of us, you know, like to actually be with people, you know, in the flesh. I mean, that's a huge part of what motivates folks who want to go into public service. We tend to like people, actually, right? You know, and enjoy spending time with people, even as folks can be difficult. I think that there are nevertheless creative opportunities that lie in front of us through the use of remote technology. I think that, for one, it may be possible that, assuming that we can be effective in our messaging, effective in our marketing, that the relative ease with which somebody is able to simply turn on a computer, boot up, and log into a conference call means that, on a logistical level, there ought to be opportunities to reach out to parts of our constituencies who are perhaps not traditionally engaged in direct conversation with their civic and political leaders, as well as their fellow constituents, members of a given community, and actually find entryway into important conversations regarding local government, local governance, and local communities that they never would have been able to take advantage of before, because you have to work a day job. If you're taking care of one or two kids, you've got to make your way across town to go to a city council meeting. That basically becomes an opportunity that is the property of a relatively privileged few who have the time, who have the resources, who have the bandwidth to be able to engage in those sorts of conversations. And some of you may be observing this already in your own communities, although I'd be curious to know. I think that there is also a resource in being able to reach well outside of our own geographic vicinity in order to bring our constituents into conversation with authorities, with leaders, with professionals, but also potentially with other communities, depending on the context and how creative we might want to get, in a manner that can, depending on the given problem, depending on the given dynamic of a certain, you know, local community, might represent opportunities for communal cross-pollination and cross-pollination of local governments, wherein we can share ideas, we can share experiences, we can expand perspectives, and otherwise contribute positively to this project that I tried to articulate a little bit a moment ago, of allowing for the culture of local government, the way in which local government leaders are able to reach more effectively across divides and communicating with constituents, to become something that cross-pollinates in the culture of the country, broadly speaking, right? With remote technology, there are actually pathways for us to initiate geography-defying conversations in ways that might allow the way we do things locally to have more of an impact nationally. So those are a couple of thoughts that come to my mind, but ultimately I think that an attitude of experimentation, an attitude of creativity, and a willingness to try things using these new mediums and to, not be intimidated by, dropped drop calls and so forth, and people not being able to get past a waiting room, and maybe Zoom bombers now and again and so forth, to wade through some of those technical hassles, to be able to make the most of the technology and to try new things. An attitude of experimentation and creativity is going to be paramount, I think, in adapting to the constraints and the opportunities of the age that we are in. And so I say that, hoping that we can all be together in person sometime very soon. And Erica, I'm hoping to see you in Sacramento, and maybe some of the folks on this call. But in the meantime, let's make the most of the tools that we have. And I'm confident that the folks on this call absolutely will.
Absolutely, and thank you for that. And I'm so excited for the dialogue that we've had, and I want to acknowledge that we have covered a little bit of ground, but there's so much more to cover, and I know we can't hit it all today, but one of the things we want to do with Leading Local is make sure that you do have a roadmap for moving forward, and to make sure that our conversations aren't just talk as lively as they are, but that they're also about action. So we want to make sure that all registrants will get some additional resources and a copy of this PDF deck, which will show you some links and resources, and we're going to go over a couple of them really quickly now. And put forward some recommendations for maybe how you can address some of this in your communities in the context of your role as local government leaders. I love what you said, John, about being willing to experiment and to leverage and take advantage of those digital resources and assets and what social media affords us. There are certainly pros and cons, but lots of opportunities, and we've seen some of that with our public engagement efforts and really thinking about outside of the public meeting, really going into the workshop space and thinking about other informational sessions that you can host for your communities that really give people a chance to dialogue, even in a virtual environment, get to know one another outside of that 3-minute comment window. How do we get out of the constructs of those public meetings into something that's a little bit more about relationships and trust? We absolutely support that and look forward to recommending some ideas for that. Let's keep moving into the recommendations section and highlight some for you. We'll ask next for the next slide, please, with some suggestions for you. Just high-level suggestions for you. Opportunities include focusing on good governance. So many of you are local agency leaders that have a governance structure, and really honing in on that governance structure and thinking about how you can outline and identify your codes of conduct, outline and identify and make very clear your expectations related to behavior and related to how you engage, not only within your internal staff, but also with your council, with your board of supervisors, with your elected officials, and also with your community. Acknowledge and honor the humanity and the lived experiences of your community when you are engaging with them. Be empathetic, and that will help you certainly to connect and create that trust. Model that civility, but honor your own foundational values. And you can be empathetic, you can be kind without diminishing that. And lead by example. If you expect others to be civil, you should be civil as well. If you expect others to be kind, you should be kind as well. Acknowledge and respect all of the parties in play. And then seek impartial leadership and governance support if you need it. If you are having a hard time navigating this and you can't, as a staff member, get in the middle of it, a third-party person might be able to say what you cannot. Feel free and consider doing that. And certainly we have recommendations for some ways to do that. Next slide, please. Here are a few resources. There are national organizations that are working to bridge partisan divides. In addition to Braver Angels, these are just a few of the organizations and resources that might be useful for local leaders that are really struggling to broker these difficult conversations, unite polarized communities. One framework I really like is from an organization called Better Arguments. And I'll ask you to go to the next slide, which highlights a couple things. And they call it the 3 dimensions of arguing better. And these are some strategies and tactics for addressing this issue. They recommend remembering that today's civic arguments are rooted in history. Being able to have an argument and reckoning with our differences to forge solutions is really important for our democracy. Thinking about emotional intelligence, really acknowledging that and understanding that the other party is certainly taking a stance, but that doesn't necessarily negate your validity of your opinion. And how do you work together to do that? Have that emotional intelligence moving into it. And then last, recognize power. And in this state, certainly local leaders do have some, and you have to consider the role that you play and the power that you wield and the responsibility that comes with it when you're engaging in conversations, especially when you're engaging with those conversations with that member of the public that's standing at the podium in that public comment window saying things that are difficult to hear. Acknowledge your power, and then also remember that there is a role to play to share the values that you have. Next slide. There are a couple principles that they have that I think are really great, and we're going to give you more details on these. I'll link you when we send follow-up information. Again, this is from Better Arguments. We want to give them the credit for it, another partner of ours that we're working with to develop resources for local agencies. These are some really great ones. Take winning off the table, acknowledge that you want to reinstate civility and bring common community, prioritizing relationships, thinking about how you can build trust first, listen to learn and not to win. I do love that. Pay attention to the context of the conversation, acknowledge culture, acknowledge some of the big hairy elephants maybe that might be in your room, acknowledge that the community is really interested in dialogue about that community and some of the key and very specific issues that that community is dealing with. And that might not be geographic community, that might be ethnic community or other demographic. Acknowledge that and think about the community benefit that you can bring with this conversation. Embrace your vulnerability. Certainly that's a difficult one. It's uncharted territory for local leaders and certainly something that we're all working through, but let's honor that and figure out how to empower our communities with that awareness without losing that sense of identity and self-respect. But it is possible. It is a challenging balance, but it's an important one. And the last one is making room to transform and thinking about better arguments as an opportunity to transform. And when I say better arguments, I say being willing to have a difficult conversation for the sake of moving forward, for the sake of understanding, for the sake of learning more about your community and about your potential person that thinks a little bit differently than you do. And that can be applied both personally and professionally. Next slide. As I mentioned, this is just the beginning of a dialogue that we hope to have. We actually do have a conversation planned, an in-depth conversation at the Cal Cities Annual Conference and Expo on the same topic, and it's bridging divides, but it's bringing in a number of other local government leaders at the city level. We are excited to have members from the city of Davis and the city of West Sacramento who have experienced some of these topics firsthand and are absolutely able to share the insights with John and all of you about how this has impacted them as elected officials and staff in some cases. You can still register for that conference, and the information is on the website. Next slide. We have additional leading local webinars, and we're so excited. Our next session is actually a rescheduled session from earlier this month. It's about reopening anxiety, and that's next Friday. We're going to be hearing about local agencies that can navigate the personal, legal, and operational impacts of return to work. So that's really important given that Delta variant and some of the challenges that we're all seeing as people go back to work and kids go back to school. That is a complicating factor. Next slide, please. In our future leading local sessions, we're actually going to hear from authors and academics and a number of others. And so some of the topics we're going to cover are shown on the next slide. That is everything from, like I said, this is the beginning of the Bridging Divides conversation, but then there's also conversations about, how do you maintain other levels of personal resilience during this time of challenge. Next slide. And these are some of our leading local webinars. Next slide, please. In addition to leading local, we're actually hosting a number of other webinars. Next week, we're actually doing a session on equity and transportation with UC Davis. We've got a number of sessions on housing, including climate resilient land use and housing policies, and some housing strategies to tackle homelessness. And we're doing those in partnership with housing and community development. We are also, if you go to the next slide, launching our public engagement training series. And in that training series, we actually do go step by step through some opportunities for you to leverage that virtual environment to engage your community, to build trust, to do more on the ground to help support your communities and also support your staff that are working with public engagement throughout the state and then maybe are having a little bit of a challenge with community-based organizations or other advocacy organizations. This virtual training will help them get through that, and we would love to have you. Next slide. We hope you'll stay connected with us and stay informed about the latest educational training and resources we have for local agencies. These are all of our handles and how you stay in touch with us. This is the best way to know what sessions are coming up, and we hope you will continue with our website, which notes here, and all of our social media handles where we post frequently about what's new, what's coming, and we like to highlight and really celebrate those local agencies that are doing amazing work in collaboration. Next slide. And we hope to partner with Braver Angels on some additional programming and content with local government and for local government leaders, so stay tuned for more information about that. But in the meantime, please do check out their website to learn more about their exciting work nationwide. It is very, very heartening to see the work that John and his team are doing. Certainly, it is an important organization doing important work, and we are certainly in support of it, and definitely look forward to hearing more about what you do in Sacramento in September. Next slide. And I think I mentioned this, but the recording for this webinar will be available soon. Everyone who registered, and even those who don't, will have the opportunity to download it and share it electronically. So we're happy for those of you that were able to join us today, and for those of you that will listen at the recording later. We hope you enjoyed this session. We are grateful for your time. We are so grateful, John, for your insights, and for everyone that took the time today to be with us. We hope that you have an amazing rest of your afternoon. It has been our honor to have you join us. Thank you so much on behalf of the Institute for Local Government. Have a fantastic rest of your day. Thank you, Randy Kay. We can close the webinar.